So, good morning. We are coming to the end of the morning, but it's still morning. And I want to say welcome to Overcoming Private and Public Obstacles. And put it in context, we're talking about overcoming the private and public obstacles to moving in direction of holistic development, as we've been hearing discussed throughout the session so far today. My name is Sandra Dungee Glenn, and again, I'm one of the three partners to the Growth Collective, the sponsors, along with 17 Asset Management, to today's event, Philly Forward, Driving Change Through Holistic Real Estate Development. And so I'm going to be moderating this session. And joining me today is Nevins, President of PIDC, Council Member Curtis Jones from representing the Philadelphia's 4th District, Council Member Maria Quiñones-Sánchez, representing Philadelphia's 7th District, and Leslie Smallwood-Lewis, who is founder and co-owner of Mosaic Development Partners. And just to set quick context for our conversation today, we had a dynamic keynote address from Dr. Leon Caldwell, who really laid out a definition of holistic development. He said a couple of things I want to bring to this conversation. He said, first of all, we need to be thinking about real estate development as a tool. It can be a tool for the benefit of a community and residents or a tool of destruction. That was one point. He also said developers should be viewed as public health officials because the built environment has a lot of power in edifying people's mental, physical, emotional health, and their well-being. So how do we better connect the physical, the built environment to enhancing all of those things for Philadelphia residents? And another question he was put on the table, I think, in our last session, there is a big, powerful question in who owns the land? Who are the owners? And then what does that mean in terms of the power to decide the use and the benefit and the assets that are gained through development? So that's sort of the framework we're going to put around this issue of holistic development. And if that is an agreed upon way where we really should be looking at real estate development as enhancing communities in all the ways I just spoke of, what are the obstacles and barriers to that taking place in Philadelphia? And I thought it would be good to start the conversation by talking and hearing from one of our practitioners, Leslie Smallwood-Lewis, who is, again, founder and co-owner of Mosaic Development Partners. And I'm going to ask Leslie, when she kind of comes up to answer this, respond to this question, to also give a brief introduction and overview of her company. And I know Leslie well enough to know that she is someone who gives it straight, no chaser, as the old saying goes. So she's not going to hold back in being very honest. And so, Leslie, I'd like you to think about and respond to, as one of the most successful, if not the most successful, Black real estate development company in the region, what obstacles have made the kind of development we've just been talking about difficult? Neighborhood centered, impact focused development. Why is that so hard to do? And since you have members of city council here, the IEC leadership here, what is it that you think policymakers can do to kind of begin to break this down and make your job easier, your work easier?
Thank you, Sandra. And just very briefly, for those of you who don't know me, my name's Leslie Smallwood-Lewis. I am one of the founders of Mosaic Development Partners. We are a minority certified real estate development company. Our offices are in Strawberry Mansion. We've been in business since 2008, and it's been a very enlightening 14-year journey on this road of development. We focus primarily in neighborhoods. We've done several projects in some of the most difficult and impoverished areas in the city: Fair Hill, Strawberry Mansion. We're just finishing up a project in Wayne Junction, so we've been all around. But for us, I can give a pretty candid answer. Yes, because the one thing that you have to be able to utilize and know how to work with in these neighborhood projects is public subsidy, and really interacting with city council and with organizations like PIDC, who are really the conduit of the dollars that are required for projects just like this. Whenever you're working in a neighborhood like that, there's always a gap in your capital stack because there's no track record. There's no, you're not developing in these like Center City or Fishtown or places that are now developed where you're going to get kind of the top rent. But you're still paying for the same construction costs and all the professional service providers. All of that remains a static and a same kind of cost, but you're not generating the same kind of revenue because appraisers will come in, they will be very conservative. They want to cover their own behinds when they give the appraisal. So the rents come in low, all of that stuff, right? So now you're trying to get financing with appraisals that have been extremely conservative, so you can only borrow so much money on a project, but the cost is the same. So then you have to look to the city and the state and the feds, and to fill that gap in um, what's been really difficult to, I think, traverse and manage is also the timeframes in which that all has to come together for it to work. So these projects in the neighborhood, they don't allow us to, turn quickly and start generating revenue. You might get one subsidy secured, but then you might miss the deadline for the next one, and now you have to wait a whole year for that cycle to come back around. So it just makes these projects so much harder to do, which is challenging for companies like our own, because then we're still not getting to a point where we're generating revenue off of a project so that we can continue to eat, so we can continue to feed this pipeline of projects, because you're constantly, trying to wait for a project to actually evolve into something. So, I mean, one of the things that I would love for us to all put our heads together and try to figure out is how can we better coordinate those schedules so that that part of it is not so challenging for developers like Mosaic and other members of the collective. And we've had lots of talks and now with Commerce and PIDC and City Council members as to the challenge of just accessible capital. Um, Clearly, we are starting behind the eight ball. Uh, no one can dispute the fact that historically the developers in most cities across the country have been white males. So we're breaking into an industry that has been, very monogamous. So for that, we're also starting at a deficit, which means that we don't really have the capital available to us to be able to do several projects at a time. So we've been talking to Ann and Ann Fadulin and other people in the Commerce Department about, is there a tool? Is there a way of providing a accessible capital, affordable capital for kind of pre-development? Because for any development project to evolve into something that's actual financeable, you have to spend a lot of money up front to get to that point. And that's just not an easy task for developers that look like me to be able to do, or at least do multiple projects at a time. And the sensitivity that we bring to projects should not be discounted, because we are going to be very intentional and very thoughtful about who is involved in the entire development process, not just at the ownership, but who's the architect, who are the engineers, who are the attorneys working on it, who's going to be the general contractor, who's going to be the ultimate retail tenants and residents that reside in these projects. So we're very conscious of the fact that we are trying to improve a community. We're trying to really uplift a community. So we're going to be doing that extra outreach, to a certain type of end user tenant. Most of our projects, our retail tenants are women and Black and brown companies. Why? Because that's our focus, right? We have to catch up. We have a lot of work to do. And if we're not being intentional about the work that we're doing, then it's never going to come to fruition. So it's very important to have developers like Mosaic and the other members of the collective involved in projects, because we bring a certain experience and sensitivity to these projects that I think most of these projects need to have.
That's, you've laid a lot of things out there, and in terms of, I think, a number of points where either through the public sector or through private sector encouragement, for lack of a better word, it could make your job, it would make your work easier, and therefore easier to get to some of these outcomes. So I'd like to turn to Ann at this point, who again is as head of our Philadelphia PIDC, straddles the public sector and the private sector. And I'm going to ask you to give a brief intro about PIDC and your relationship to Philadelphia. And you heard Leslie, you heard her outline a number of things that are challenges for Black developers in particular, but also for challenges for any developers who are concerned about doing development in a way that where the financial bottom line is not the only thing, where they really are trying to be a benefit to the neighborhoods and communities where they're developing. So how do you think PIDC can weigh in here? And are there some things you are doing or could be doing that would be a barrier remover?
Great. Thanks, Sandra. And yes, I mean, the answer to the last question is, I think, a combination of both, and happy to jump into that and talk about some of the things we are doing, but also, opportunities that I think we have to think and do differently going forward. And I'm taking lots of notes during this session, which will really, I think, help us advance in that. But back to the first part of your question in terms of what is PIDC. So we're a nonprofit organization that's a public-private partnership. We were founded about 60 years ago, and we really focus on what we call our mission around driving growth to every corner of Philadelphia. We are, the official economic development corporation for the city of Philadelphia, and we're very pleased to have Councilmember Jones as a member of our board, and to partner with the administration, with City Council, and with the private sector, with entrepreneurs, small businesses, developers, nonprofit organizations, mid-sized companies, and larger businesses, to try to fill gaps in the market. Exactly what Leslie started off talking about from a development project perspective. That's a big part of what we try to do, kind of across all of those different segments. We really have three core strategies as an organization. The first is to support the growth, resilience, and wealth creation for our small businesses, and particularly focusing on diverse businesses and businesses located in our communities and neighborhoods. And so we do that through access to capital. That's typically through lending, although over the last couple of years, with all of the COVID impacts to small businesses and the resources that have become available through, the city with the support of City Council, as well as through the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, in terms of grant programs, we've also played a big role in delivering those resources to businesses as well. I'm hopeful that in 2022, we'll really be sort of turning the corner in terms of having opportunities to really help businesses not just survive, but really get back to thriving. And that's our hope for 2022, and to be able to use both our lending resources, but also the support services and business education kind of coming along and pairing alongside that to help entrepreneurs throughout our city to get back to maybe where they were pre-pandemic, and hopefully leap beyond that. So that's one. The second is investing in high impact community revitalization projects, again, throughout the city. Leslie's given a number of examples of those projects, because we've worked closely with Mosaic on a lot of the developments that Leslie mentioned. So, Eastern Lofts and Strawberry Mansion, the Golaski Labs project in Wayne Junction, which is also the home of the P4 Hub, founded by Diverse Force. And 7th and Lehigh, mixed use developments. So lots of the projects that Leslie just described that Mosaic has done over the years would fall into that category of, high impact community revitalization. But we've also done a lot of other things with both for-profit and nonprofit organizations, things like healthcare services, so Spectrum Health Services at 52nd and Haverford, the Esperanza Health Center at K&A, the Center for Health and Literacy with Children's Hospital in the city at Broad and Morris. So those types of facilities would fit into that as well. And then finally, the third, kind of piece to what we do is focusing on how we can catalyze inclusive growth through the strategic use of our real estate assets or partnerships around real estate. And again, back to the example with Leslie and Mosaic at the Navy Yard, that's, one example within the last couple of years where I think we've really had an opportunity to take a new approach to bring in a partnership of Mosaic with their partners at Ensemble Real Estate Investment, create a collaboration that I think is both bringing the expertise and and vision and development experience that's going to make that next phase of development at the Navy Yard incredibly successful, but also to really focus on the core around equity and inclusion. Leslie mentioned creative ways to work with minority and women-owned business tenants. That's part of the platform that we've committed to at the Navy Yard. And then also, I think from a community engagement perspective, one of the other things that Mosaic really brought to the table in terms of their proposal that was very compelling to us in the selection process was this idea of crowdfunding. And maybe we'll get into that in more detail later in terms of crowdfunded equity offering opportunities for ownership more broadly to Philadelphians. So that's, again, one example. I'm very, to the point about RFPs and what we can do to better structure and create opportunities for Black and Brown developers to take leading roles in the ownership of projects. That's something that we're definitely, looking at and thinking a lot about. What did we learn from the Navy Yard process? How can we do that and more, going forward in terms of other things that we'll be involved in? Most notably, we will be putting out to market development sites in the Lower Schuylkill, so just north and south of Bartram's Garden, targeting life sciences, particularly biomedical manufacturing. We think is a great opportunity for those sites. And I put that out there, with this group. We would love to talk to developers that might be interested in opportunities related to those sites. And that will be coming out later this spring. So I'll Sandra, I don't know if I covered enough of kind of the what is and maybe what could be. I think maybe I'll just say one more thing in terms of what Leslie mentioned also on the pre-development and acquisition funding. We have started to pilot, albeit at a very small scale, some of the pre-development and acquisition funding. We've actually worked with a couple other members of the collective, not Mosaic on that front, but a couple of the other member developers in terms of piloting that pre-development and acquisition capital to get funds in the hands of business of development projects earlier. And part of our reason for wanting to do that is the pipeline for some of those other public subsidy, programs that Leslie mentioned earlier, things like new markets tax credits that have these really long cycles, and you got to be ready with the project to be able to catch the cycle. Well, if you don't have the pre-development capital, acquisition capital, you're never going to get in the, that cycle at the right time. So that's what we're now trying to focus on. And that's something that we are definitely committed to doing more of. We'd like to, we're kind of strategizing about how to raise the capital for that and what the best way is, to do that going forward. But we definitely see that as a need, and then it can feed the pipeline for a lot of the other opportunities that are out there.
Well, and you have said a lot in that. And so there were a couple of things for you to think about. And as we continue through this, maybe come back and comment on. One is a number of things you've mentioned. One of the things I've noticed in Philadelphia is a lot of times we do things and they're almost like piloted. So you see it happens once, but it doesn't get institutionalized into a best operating practice that we're doing over and over again. Like the way you've talked about in diversifying the RFP process is one kind of thing, the access to pre-development money. And so any way that the collective and through our members can help to support this moving beyond, and be cheerleaders for you, moving beyond this just as sort of like a one and done, but this is our standard operating procedure now. That's something that's very important, so that it sticks and stays. So I appreciate that. And I want to make sure we have time for our two council members here, because I know that there's a lot of interplay between what you do at PIDC, what goes on in government, in city council, in the administration, and again, how they're feeding and complementing each other in terms of the practices that lay a different framework for development in Philadelphia. So turning now to our council members, Curtis Jones Jr. of the 4th District and Council Member Maria Quiñones-Sánchez of the 7th District. You guys have the ultimate balancing act. Much of the development underway in your district, if not most, is not what we've described as holistic. It's not centered in improving the health, wealth, and wellness of residents in Black and brown neighborhoods. In fact, residents in parts of your district fear gentrification and displacement. So after you do, as I've done with everyone else, ask you to give a brief introduction of yourselves and your district, to respond to the following question. 1, how do you encourage neighborhood-centered, impact-focused development while discouraging displacement? And then 2, what can you do, or what are you doing as a district council member to support Black and remove the kinds of barriers, again, that Leslie described? So, and I'm going to start because, I don't want you to think that just because you are the only male in this convening, Council Member Jones, that we are discriminating against you. I'm going to go first to you, and then to Council Member Maria Quiñones-Sánchez. So let me put that to you.
Well, thank you, Sandra, for inviting me to this event. And for the record, I am a board member of PIDC, and they are very shy about this. Is not their grandfather's PIDC. I'm proud to be a board member, and we funded businesses in my district and around the city in unprecedented amounts of minority and female participation. Fact. In the 4th District, I like to call it the land of the brave and the home of the free. I say that because whatever you've done before you were elected, you are just with a title. At the back of my window stands the Criminal Justice Center. Before I was elected, we put 30% on that. Herb Jones, no relation to me, was the CEO of Coastal Steel, who got that contract. That was the first time in my life, and I'm a West Philly guy all the way, that I ever wound up in a lawsuit or in a courtroom for anything because of that level of participation. I am a founding member of the African American Chamber of Commerce. I ran the Minority Business Enterprise Council for 4 years, and I mentioned 4 years because in that we did $362 million to minority and female companies, and I didn't get indicted. I say that because many of the former directors did. And so I say all that to say, whatever the past performance is the predictor of future performance. So you asked the question of how do you gain participation and keep that balance? The answer is not to talk about it so much. When I look at my district and I look at the Business and Technology Center on Parkside, it houses a large number of minority and female companies. When I go next door and look at West Park development, it was done with unprecedented levels of minority participation. When I look at my district office at 5801 Market Street, it is the largest RAPI grant, $50 million in partnership with my Senator Hughes and my state rep, Morgan Cephas, that we were able to land that. So that's the past. Where are we going with the future? You talked about holistic. My colleague, Maria Sanchez, will remember this. This was a study done by Philadelphia City Council to look at holistic community development, giving it a scorecard. So the amenities that a neighborhood has, the amount of schools, access to transportation, hospitals, work, all of those things were, and we gave neighborhoods a grade. And what we decided was not to publish it. And there were reasons for that. But let me say this, in the 4th District, we're building the Cassidy School, one of 2 schools that will be constructed this year by the school district. One of them is in my district. It is a school that will be built with minority and female participation, but it will be built in a way that if the Jetsons move to the 4th District, they're going to send their kids there and be proud of it. Right down the street, maybe 4 blocks, we are building a new Boys and Girls Club that will enhance the community that lives there. Right next to that, there is a vacant ShopRite that just was vacated, that we are pitching that to Amazon to create a distribution center out there. From PIDC's coffers, we have EMSCO, who is putting the final touches on a brand new headquarters. We have Alpha Office Supplies. So what I am trying to tell you is that often you can't brag about what you do, because many of my colleagues wind up in court about it. And so we in the 4th District, and I don't want to speak for my colleague in the 7th, have to navigate often dangerous and legally dangerous situations to make sure that our communities benefit, most importantly, and that Black and brown contractors benefit. So I push back gently to say that we're not doing it, but just because I don't wear a sign on my forehead about it doesn't mean it's not happening.
So, Councilman, let me just ask, since we're focusing on the issues of development, what do you see as the role for Black developers in the kind of activities that you've talked about?
So I agree they should be prime contractors. They should be joint venture partners, meaningful joint venture partners in projects that at least we control the land. We just did an RFP for 55th and Poplar. We're looking at 50 townhomes that we're going to put there. We want that, encourage that type of participation on those kinds of projects. That RFP went out last week. We were able to negotiate 42 units from PHA that we are going to put in 5 and 10 unit bids out for local developers to do, with the proviso that they take a young person who might be at risk and mentor them in the construction trade and process, almost like a handyman, excuse me, be politically correct, handy person program. And we're insisting and wrote that into the RFP that is coming out by the Redevelopment Authority. So look at Marion Avenue. We are looking to change the zoning. If you go by there now, it's a big junkyard, but that's 100 potential units to be placed on that site. It's 3.5 acres. So the use of land and being able to influence and kind of direct that land is the strategic partnership that developers need. Maria Quiñones-Sánchez, who you'll hear from next, has been beset with a lot of that. We are just on the beginning phases of what people fear in gentrification. So I've learned from the 7th District on taking inventory of what is within government control and being able to leverage that to say, if you want this piece of land, let me be point blank. I went to Atlanta when I first got in this game. I'm an old head on this line. I'm older than you. Understand?
Say that again?
I am older than you, correct?
By a couple months, yeah.
Okay. When I first came to government and ran the Minority Business Enterprise Council, I went to the mecca of participation, which was then Atlanta. And I met with Maynard Jackson. And what he told me is what I'm telling you. He didn't rely on a law to do it. He relied on the leverage of land and the political will to get it done. And that's how we do it in the 4th District.
Well, we stand ready to work with you. And I know you shared a few of those, and I share with our collective members the RFP for the 55th and Poplar. And so just knowing and having the opportunity to make sure that they're at the table and able and in position to respond is the beginning of the battle. So thank you for that. And I want to make sure, because I know when we talk about development and being proactive around development, the council member Maria Quiñones-Sánchez has basically been the poster child for that, and actually came to the collective and asking us to help her design a process that would be most beneficial to diverse developers, and making sure that Black and Brown developers could be at the table for. So thank you for taking that initiative, Council Member Quiñones-Sánchez. And I want to give you a chance to respond to the same questions about how do you deal with community-centered development, encouraging that, discouraging displacement, and then how do you help developers like Leslie and Mosaic in terms of overcoming the kinds of barriers that she spoke about earlier?
Well, thank you, Sandra and the collective, for an opportunity to talk a little bit about what we're doing. And I'm going to focus a little bit, since, I think Councilmember Jones spoke to, there's a lot of stuff going on, and Nevins will tell you there's a lot of stuff going on. Leslie will tell you there's a lot of stuff going on. But I think one of the things that I'm the most excited about around this moment in time is that, as disastrous as COVID was and the social unrest, we can really talk about these issues, about structural racism, some of the institutional problems, in a way that we can be unapologetic about. Recovery has to look different, and that this issue of inclusion is no longer a discussion that we have but it's like when and how. Right. And so I think Councilmember Jones has given specifics about, where there's political will on the ground, as is the case in the 4th Councilmatic District, as the case in the 7th. There's a lot of things you can do what you have. But one of the things I want to talk about is a little bit around the toolboxes and why residents in particular, when we're talking about development, really including the engagement. And Leslie spoke about when she does a development project, how she comes to it with a different perspective and the value of that, because that's important, right? So, development cannot happen off islands. We really have to look at neighborhoods. Councilmember Jones represents neighborhoods more stable, that still require investment, right, and planning. I come from a community that has been marginalized, historically disinvested, right, and where people don't trust that the development coming in is about them, but about who's coming new, right? And so we have to counter all that NIMBYism that exists. And how do you do that? It's around equitable development that really treats neighborhoods like they're already an asset, right? And what we're bringing in is to complement and create those walkable neighborhoods, but it's with them in mind, right? And with the folks that are coming in, as opposed to how do you bring the development to bring new people in without this approach around residents. And how do you do that? Those are toolboxes. And council has been really in the forefront of this, whether it's our UPA, our LOOP program, our TAP program. The most affordable house people have is the one they're living in, right? And so this notion of how do you keep people in their neighborhoods and how do they leverage their equity is the work that we've done, the $100 million investment in basic systems. And so we've sent a message to residents that we care about you, and they need to see that investment and feel it in their infrastructure. We talk about parks and recreation, and for many of us, we've been doing this work before Rebuild. Rebuild allows you to put it on steroids and say what role does parks and open spaces play in quality of life for residents, even if they lived in fixed incomes, right? We can still improve their quality of life. But then you take toolboxes, right, and which are hugely important, and we can't ask the private sector to do what government's unwilling to do. Like, I really believe public policy helps shape neighborhood. We can advocate for CRA reinvestment. We know banks redline, right? We've asked our depositors, Councilwoman Bass has been a huge advocate of our depositors and banks doing business with the city. What are you doing in neighborhoods, and not letting them bail out, right? And using the new technology to say we're taking branches and those types of investments out of the neighborhood. But the land bank is a perfect example of of that, right? And I think equitable development has to look different, and we have to talk about it differently. So for us in particular in South Kensington, which is my rapidly gentrifying neighborhood, and it's not just the neighborhood that I represent, it's also where I live, right? So when I'm walking my dog, I'm getting it directly from residents about what they feel the pressures are. And there is a cultural shift that happens when a lot of new people come in, and for a developer not to recognize that and acknowledge it in the front end, you miss the boat. You lose the trust that people have by saying, I'm going to enhance your neighborhood, but I'm not going to change the culture, you know, the elements that come as part of this development. How you develop. We've been really intentional in redeveloping our parks, for instance, that recognize those communities that live in there, from color schemes to themes to all of those things that say to those current residents, this is for you. And those are hugely important. If we do that well, when we're doing development and we're talking about bringing development in, people are more willing to be accepting, and we can work through some of the NIMBYism that exists. You know, I'm the author of mixed income housing, which is, I think, a toolbox, right? It's not going to work in every neighborhood. It can't work in every neighborhood, but it's a toolbox that people should use. You know, in our district, we've done mandatory affordable housing on American Street and other areas, the most aggressive in the city, because there is an automatic value. But what do we do moving forward? For me, the land bank and its prioritizing side lots. There are residents who have sweat equity in what they're keeping their neighborhood safe. And we can't say from a public policy perspective, we're going to sell this land because we can make short-term money and not honor the work that they've done in the neighborhood. So we have a very aggressive plan to give people land that they've taken care of. That's equitable development. Gardens and green spaces, honoring the work and the sweat equity that was there. And then you can talk about the type of development that we need to be talking about now. And NPI is another, neighborhood preservation initiative, is another way that council is saying we want to leverage the assets that already exist. And then we want to make sure that in this development, we are very focused around equitable development. And you're right, building wealth, we should be unapologetic about saying we want to build wealth in Black and Brown for Black and Brown developers, right? We want to build wealth as it relates to contractors, and do it in a way that it is about that equitable development. Nationally, you know, Biden talks about Build Back Better. Locally, we're talking about it. And to your point, you know, and Ann, who testified in council the other day, talked about this. This stuff has to be institutionalized. It can't be about when Maria's here or when Ann's there. It's like, let's write this in, memorialize it, and it becomes standard operating practices. And then more importantly, all right, let's really penalize people who've been in this system and have worked the system to discriminate and marginalize, right? Because I also think there's like the carrot. I'm all for incentivizing public and private partnerships, but I'm also for, you are not inclusive. Your business model is not respectful to the communities that are here, and you should not have access to this stuff. And we don't do a good enough job, because I think if we had a balanced approach about that, I think you would see more inclusion in projects that are real, right? Where you're respecting your minority partner as we're building these primes. And historically, that hasn't happened. And Leslie will tell you, she's been part of probably a lot of partnerships initially in the beginning where it was tokenism, and they really didn't value the talent that she brought, the skill set. You know, we talk about measuring, again, the same way people have put equity in their neighborhood. Developers of color come with equity around their lived experiences that folks do not, there's no quantifiable way to bring that at the table. So I think these discussions are hugely important, and I encourage folks to hold us accountable to that. How we use land and how the land bank distributes land speaks to if in fact we are valuing and we're going to change the recovery to be more inclusive. In South Kensington, as you said, there's automatic value there because it's a community that is gentrifying, and we have a robust menu of toolboxes. You had 267 properties that we got from PHA. We had the land bank property. I have 4,000 lots in the 7th Councilmatic District. There's enough for everybody to develop, right? But how that gets utilized, leveraged, and rebuilt really speaks to the values of whether we're going to be a more inclusive society. And look, and I'll end with with this, especially as it relates to displacement. I have a lot of my neighbors in Norris Square who bought their houses for $9,000, $12,000, right? And they've cashed out. And I'm not going to begrudge them for saying, hey, I'm going to leave Norris Square and I'm going somewhere else and taking that equity and buying that, right? But they choose to do that, not because they have to do that, because of public policy and us not respecting and honoring, you know, their role in the community. And I think public policy shapes it, but I think the private market and those public-private partnerships are going to be key if we're really going to move the city forward.
So Maria, how do you really feel about this? You're so shy and retiring. I mean, that was awesome. You hit on so many things. You hit on so many things. I want to just lift them up and in the last 5 minutes, ask each of you in closeout to kind of focus on one thing. But you use words like respect, value, assets, that we're coming into neighbor communities that are already asset laden, and that there's got to be a center to the focus of this, and the existing residents being the center of the growth and development as opposed to an afterthought. So I think those are some core themes that really need to be taken to heart as we talk about the policy of this. You also hit on a point that I know is a sore point for many of our developers, which is the land bank, and getting them to move more quickly and in a clearer way about the criteria that's being used to determine which are the best, what would you call it, kind of responses, I guess, for development. And how do you make sure that the uses are tied into the best uses for the community? And that, so thinking about that, how that fits in with the land bank. So we've got 4 minutes left. I'm gonna do a round robin, maybe 35 seconds each. Ask you, so what is one thing, if you had to think of one thing you can focused on around this issues of removing barriers and obstacles, one thing. And I'll start with Leslie as our developer.
One thing, you know, it's hard for me to answer that, Sandra. I really, if I could comment on just something that Councilman Quiñones-Sánchez mentioned about equitable development and really focusing on the community. You know, crowdfunding. I just want to bring that up very quickly because Ann Nevins had mentioned it, and we have done it twice at 2 of our programs or projects, and it has really uplifted the community because they were able to invest in a project that occurs right in their neighborhood. And we're carrying that down to the Navy Yard, and that's something that Greg and I have really pushed there because we want that same kind of impact so that all Philadelphians can feel as if they're a part of this project at the Navy Yard and can invest as little as $500 and become an owner of or a piece of that project.
I take that as your answer as crowdfunding, and I'm gonna keep it moving.
Yes,
Leslie,
absolutely.
Councilman Jones.
I guess what I would suggest is equal access to information. I appreciate what's happening down in Navy Yard, but I have the paper mill that's 30 acres of stranded asset that everybody's down there in that line and nobody's up in that line. I would also say access to information such as Bud Biotech up on Hunting Park, where the Bud plant used to be, are now micro entrepreneurs that are very techy. It's becoming the West Coast version of the Silicon Valley up there. They've put $500 million with a B up there to attract young, aggressive firms to take a piece of that market. There is plenty of acreage up there. And
I'm gonna stop you right there, Councilman. Those are 2 good pieces, but access to information. Council Member Quiñones-Sánchez.
So public policy that really incentivizes public-private partnerships in a way that recognizes in lower value neighborhoods, you know, how do we, you know, and everybody has touched it, that soft costs related to doing equitable development, how public policy supports that. And again, in a real unapologetic way, that this is what we need to do in this market that has been disinvested so that we can get that equitable development that the community deserves.
Excellent. And to, last but certainly not least, PIDC President Ann Nevins.
Sandra, I'm going to pick up on where you and the council member left off, and I'm going to say, how do we move things from a pilot to being institutionalized and scaled, and moving things from pilot to standard operating procedure? So.
Awesome. You guys were an awesome panel. I want to thank you each for your contribution to this conversation. We are going to keep it going. And I want to now just make sure that folks stay and participate in our upcoming panel, which is going to be expertise in building holistic communities, more examples of what it looks like to do development from this perspective. And the discussion will feature Taib Smith of Smith and Roller Holdings, Lorraine Wilson Drake of Wilson Drake Developers, Dr. Leon Caldwell of Ujima Developers, and Anthony Fillard of West Powelton Development. So thank you all again to our panelists, Councilmember Curtis Jones, Jr., President Ann Nevins of PIDC, Councilmember Maria Quiñones-Sánchez, and Leslie Smallwood-Lewis of Mosaic Development. You guys were great. Thank you all so much. And please stay with us for the rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right.